Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And today I want to cast us back around 13 years to 2009, to the darker days of Disney, where they'd been on their biggest dry spell in years. After the glory days of the Renaissance, Walt Disney Animated Studios stalled and hit a long period of creative and commercial stagnation, whilst other studios, like Pixar and DreamWorks, were going from strength to strength, releasing films that were received really well, whilst also making a big impact on the box office, making large profits and embedding themselves into the public eye. Making films that people remember and that are not lost in the shuffle or to the slow decay of time. And Disney wanted in on that action. They wanted to return to the glory days. They wanted to be the big dog once again. And so they went back to their roots and began the process of creating another princess film. After all, princess films kicked off their two previous golden periods with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and The Little Mermaid, so why couldn't they do it again? Why couldn't they manage to kickstart the Disney revival era and return the studio to the top of the industry? And so, this began the journey of developing The Princess and the Frog, which was to be their fresh start. And for those that might be a little less familiar or perhaps haven't seen the film in quite a while, I'll give you a rundown. The film's set in New Orleans during the height of the Roaring Twenties and follows the character of Tiana, a young waitress trying to live her dream to open her own restaurant, but who's struggling to afford a down payment on a potential premises. At a party celebrating the arrival of Prince Naveen to the city, she encounters the prince who's been transformed into a frog via voodoo magic by Dr. Facilier. Believing her kiss can break the spell, Naveen begs Tiana to kiss him, but when she does, she's also turned into a frog as she isn't a true princess. Fleeing into the bayou, the two encounter a jazz-loving crocodile who aspires to play in a band, and a firefly who's fallen in love with the evening star, and they guide them to Mama Odie, whilst the pair begin to fall in love along the way. And after being told the spell will only break with a princess's kiss, Naveen decides to go ahead and kiss the daughter of the Mardi Gras king before midnight and marry her to ensure that the spell's broken, and so he can afford to set up Tiana's restaurant, despite the pair having fallen in love. Dr. Facilier gets involved and prevents the kiss from breaking, Ray is killed, Dr. Facilier gets dragged down into hell for failing to pay his debts, and the curse finally breaks when Naveen and Tiana get married and kiss, as that makes her a princess by marriage, fulfilling the terms of the spell and allowing them to live there happily ever after and open the restaurant together. And this film was received pretty well at the time of its release, at least from a critical perspective. It earned a decent score of 85% on Rotten Tomatoes from 201 reviews, and a 73 out of 100 on Metacritic, which indicates generally favourable critical response. Plus, it got 3 Oscar nominations, 2 for Best Original Song and 1 for Best Animated Feature. People were pretty happy with it. Did they think it hit the highs of the past? No, but it definitely felt like a bit of a redemption for the studio. It did a lot of things right. It was a step back into the golden eras of Disney. It might not have completely lived up to the absolute top level of that standard, but it feels like it would have fit in those eras regardless. And there really are a few contributing factors that make this a high quality film. For starters, it felt original. Many of the Disney Animated Studios films are based on fairy tales or books, some sort of classic source material. And indeed, The Princess and the Frog is no exception in this, as it's clearly based on the book The Frog Princess, which in turn draws on the old fairy tale The Frog Prince. But instead of just using the same generic fairy tale land, which is vaguely medieval, the film transplants the story into a more modern setting. Still old enough to feel fantastical, but recent enough to feel relatable. It has great songs and a thrilling plot, exciting and well-developed characters with goals and motivations of their own. It's colourful and vibrant, and just feels wholly unique compared to other Disney princess films, and indeed, other Disney films in general. It just has this innate quality about it that makes it feel special. And so that's probably why it's one of the sadder entrants into the forgotten Disney films category. It really does deserve more, but ultimately, it didn't really set the world on fire in terms of its commercial success, only grossing $271 million off a budget of $105 million. And so whilst it did do well and definitely outperformed the 2D traditional films that Disney had put out since Tarzan's release in 1999, it didn't capture that same audience like the Disney films of yesteryear. It didn't hit those same highs, because not as many people went to see it. Simple as that. Plus, years on, it's one of those films that everybody seems to love when it gets brought up, but it never gets mentioned on its own. You sort of stumble across it from time to time and think, oh yeah, that movie is great. Wow, gotta watch it again at some point. And it's at this very moment that you go back to forgetting its existence again until it's brought up again somehow. And it's sad because I think it deserves a bit better than that. And honestly, at first I couldn't really put my finger on why it was forgotten. Why it didn't do as well as the princess films that would only come out a few short years later. It's not like the plot or the characters or soundtrack was weak, so what's the major issue? And so I did a little bit of digging to try and puzzle out the reason as to why this might be the case. And I think I've narrowed it down to maybe two major reasons that sort of tie together to form the overarching statement of wrong time, wrong place. But let's break that down a little bit more. And we'll start off with the title. And yeah, this is a weird one to point to as the reason for the film's lesser success, but Disney has actually come out, well, at least important members that worked on the film have come out, and openly said the marketing department believed that using princess in the title was a recipe for disaster, as it signals to the audience that this is a film primarily made for little girls. People take things quite literally, and thus you close off a whole section of potential customers, in this case parents, who would think that their son might not want to see a film about princesses, so they don't bother. More generic titles like Tangled or Frozen tend to do a lot better at attracting widespread appeal, despite having similar subject matter. And the reason that their advice was disregarded at the time was because the studio was certain that the animation quality and the throwback style of using traditional animation would be enough to draw people in and make the movie an overall box office success. Suffice to say, they were wrong. And why were they wrong? Why? Because the 2D animation was not what people wanted. It wasn't the popular style for the time. It wasn't the lucrative style for the time. It didn't earn the money. It's clear that the use of 2D style was a bit of a love letter to films of the past, and was led by a desire to return to the studio's roots, so to speak. It was believed that this would be a celebrated return, that the people would be so excited to finally get a classic Disney film. But it wasn't the right time. It had only been a couple of years since Disney's last traditional animation, so it's not like people were chomping at the bit for something new. So it had not been near long enough to consider this a retro throwback style like people might say about films like Klaus today. And so people weren't going to rush into it to get their nostalgic hit. And on top of that, 3D computer animation had been exploding in popularity at the time. Pixar was releasing hit after hit. DreamWorks was mostly on top of their game. Everywhere you looked it was 3D. That's what people were excited for. The advancements in animation, making things look realistic and good. And so those two elements combined. On the one hand, people were eager for this new visual style that looked more and more realistic with each passing film, and then this is compounded on by the perception of traditional animation as old and outdated, backwards. And so ultimately, despite being a really solid film that would fit in any era of the company, The Princess and the Frog, due to poor marketing and short-sighted design choices, failed to impress at the box office, and thus it's been relegated to the sad little film that sits quietly in the corner. And I think that's a damn shame. But anyway, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the film? Think it deserves more, or maybe you don't see the appeal? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.